telescreens monitoring every breath, a thought police force that arrests citizens for the crimes in their own heads, thousands of people screaming in uniform hatred at an ever-changing enemy. In the middle of this vast machine is Winston Smith. He is a low-level bureaucrat whose entire job consists of dropping inconvenient historical records down an incinerator and rewriting old newspapers to match today's state-sanctioned reality. We read this today as a science fiction nightmare, but the state of Oceania is a ledger of the mid-century present. Orwell wasn't looking into a crystal ball to predict a distant future. He was observing the rise of total control in his own time. That author was Eric Arthur Blair, better known by his pen name, George Orwell. To understand how he constructed this totalitarian world, we have to look at the real events of the early 20th century that gave him the blueprints. Once the historical roots of 1984 are exposed, the novel stands as a documented warning about the mechanics of power. Blair's education in the mechanics of state control began early. In the 1920s, he served in the imperial police in Burma, enforcing colonial rule and witnessing how a rigid bureaucracy manages subjugated populations. He eventually resigned to become a writer, a path that led him directly to the front lines of the Spanish Civil War. There, he fought in a militia and was thrust into a chaotic web of shifting political alliances and violent internal betrayals. In Spain, factions that fought side by side one week were suddenly labeled traitors the next, with the official narrative rewriting itself overnight. This lethal political whiplash became the foundation for Oceania's state of perpetual war. In the novel, the state executes a seamless pivot right in the middle of a public hate rally. The enemy changes instantly, and the state declares that the new enemy has always been the enemy. Watching the geopolitical chaos of the 1930s taught Orwell a grim lesson. A continuous, ever-shifting war is never meant to be won. It is an internal mechanism designed solely to consume resources and keep the domestic population living in a state of terrified obedience. By the time Orwell was outlining his ideas, the world had endured a brutal decade of global conflict, civil wars, and revolutions. The result was a massive global tightening of political attitudes. The grand utopian promises had collapsed. Instead of equality, every new political theory defaulted back to strict hierarchy and regimentation. Tactics abandoned for centuries returned to the mainstream. Public executions, imprisonment without trial, and systemic torture were defended by progressive systems. These weren't hypothetical threats. The Soviet show trials and fascist purges of the 1930s were active trials for how effectively a state could terrorize its own citizens into total compliance. Orwell synthesized all of this into the ideology of Ingsoc. Ingsoc, short for English socialism, is the fictional political theory governing Oceania, built entirely out of the authoritarian practices of that era. When readers encounter the horrors of the Ministry of Love, the novel's center of torture and brainwashing, they are reading a direct reflection of the brutal, systemic violence normalized by world powers during Orwell's lifetime. This brings us to the chilling aspect of Orwell's world. Winston Smith doesn't work in a torture dungeon. He sits in a clinical, bureaucratic office, quietly doctoring old newspapers to ensure the past always aligns with the party's current narrative. The philosophical core of Ingsoc argues that past events have no objective existence. History only survives in two places: written records and human memories. Because the party controls all physical records and uses terror to control the minds of its citizens, they have the absolute power to dictate reality. They twist the truth into whatever shape fits today's agenda. To maintain this control, the party forces citizens to develop a reflex called crime stop. Crime stop is the psychological ability to halt a heretical or dangerous thought before it fully forms in the mind. Older despotisms relied on the command, "Thou shalt not," punishing disobedience after the fact. The totalitarians of Oceania operate on the command, "Thou art." They don't just kill heretics, they brutally wash the entire brain clean, forcing citizens to genuinely believe the lie before they are destroyed. The ultimate weapon of this state was the targeted administrative destruction of objective truth, a vulnerability Orwell recognized after watching the vast propaganda machines of the 1930s at work. Orwell built 1984 as a surgical diagnosis of the authoritarianism taking root in the mid-20th century. Orwell reached a terrifying conclusion about these regimes. They don't seize power with the intention of eventually stepping down or creating a paradise. The acquisition and retention of power is the only objective. Surveillance, historical revisionism, and the total eradication of the individual self. Every tool used by the fictional state of Oceania was tested in our own history to strip away human individuality. This is why the novel's impact endures. It serves as an operating manual in reverse. By exposing the methods of mind control and mass surveillance, it teaches readers exactly how to identify political overreach. The lasting power of Orwell's work is the burden it places on us. It forces every generation to look closely at their own institutions and ask if they are protecting objective truth or letting the past be altered.